There comes a moment in some relationships that almost nobody talks about, because from the outside nothing seems to change. No message arrives, no dramatic confession appears, no plane lands, no door opens, and yet something invisible shifts so completely that the future quietly begins moving toward you. If this title pulled you in, it may be because somewhere inside you, despite every disappointment, you still feel that the person on your mind is finally becoming happy again, and that whatever has kept you apart is beginning to lose its power. That feeling is not always wishful thinking. Sometimes your heart notices a change long before your eyes can find evidence for it. The strange part is that when emotional separation truly starts ending, it rarely begins with physical movement. It begins inside the one who had been unable to move at all. You have probably wondered many times whether the waiting has changed them or simply changed you. At first, the distance felt temporary. You counted weeks, then months, perhaps even years, believing that love could survive if you only remained patient. But eventually the calendar stopped being your enemy. Instead, uncertainty became the heavier burden. You stopped asking when they would return and began asking whether they still carried the same feelings. That question quietly reshaped your entire emotional world. It made you examine every memory, every conversation, every silence, searching for proof that what once felt undeniable had not disappeared. Yet the answer you were looking for was never hidden inside the past. It was developing inside someone who had not yet found peace within themselves. People often assume that emotional distance is caused by a lack of love, but Jung understood something far more uncomfortable. Human beings do not only run from what they dislike, sometimes they run from what matters too much. A connection that awakens forgotten wounds, old fears, or unresolved parts of the self can become overwhelming. Love is not always frightening because it asks someone to give. Sometimes it is frightening because it asks someone to receive something they no longer believe they deserve. That creates a painful contradiction. They miss you, yet avoid you. They imagine life beside you, yet keep postponing it. They think about returning, yet convince themselves that tomorrow will somehow be easier than today. This inner contradiction has likely confused you more than anything else. You may have mistaken hesitation for rejection. You may have believed that if someone truly wanted to be with you, nothing could possibly keep them away. That sounds logical, until you remember how human beings actually work. We are rarely driven by logic during our deepest emotional struggles. We are driven by old beliefs, invisible fears, and unconscious defenses that quietly shape every decision. The person you think of may have spent far more energy trying to silence their feelings than expressing them. Ironically, the stronger those feelings became, the harder they tried to convince themselves that creating more distance would somehow restore emotional balance. Instead, it only created emptiness. There is something exhausting about pretending not to care when your heart refuses to cooperate. Every attempt to move on becomes another reminder of what still remains unfinished. Every distraction eventually loses its ability to distract. Every new routine eventually brings them back to the same quiet thought they tried to escape before. That is why emotional suppression rarely lasts forever. The mind can create convincing arguments, but the emotional self patiently waits underneath them. It does not shout. It simply continues existing until pretending becomes more exhausting than telling the truth. Perhaps you noticed something unusual lately, without fully understanding it. Maybe memories have begun appearing more often. Maybe certain songs suddenly feel different. Maybe dreams have become strangely vivid. Many people dismiss these experiences as coincidence, yet psychology offers another possibility. When an important emotional bond begins reorganizing itself internally, your own subconscious often becomes more attentive, not because it possesses magical knowledge, but because it constantly notices patterns your conscious mind overlooks. Tiny changes in memory, expectation, emotional openness, and intuition begin connecting in ways that create the quiet feeling that something is approaching. What is remarkable is that happiness often becomes the missing ingredient before reunion becomes possible. This sounds almost backwards because we assume that reunion creates happiness, yet in many emotionally complicated relationships, the opposite is true. A person trapped inside anxiety, shame, guilt, or unresolved conflict cannot truly come home emotionally because they are not at home within themselves. Before they can return to someone else, they must first stop fighting themselves. They must finally believe that peace is allowed, They must stop seeing love as another responsibility they will inevitably fail. Only then does the path back begin looking less frightening than the road away. This explains why their emotional energy may feel different even before their actions change. Someone who once felt emotionally frozen slowly begins becoming emotionally available. Their thoughts no longer revolve entirely around survival or self-protection. They begin imagining ordinary moments again, breakfast together, quiet evenings, familiar conversations, shared laughter. None of these images seem dramatic, yet they reveal something profound. The future has quietly replaced fear. That shift often happens long before anyone says a single word. For someone who has lived with emotional conflict for a long time, happiness arrives almost suspiciously. At first they question it. They wonder whether they deserve it. They expect something to go wrong because disappointment has become more familiar than peace. Yet after enough time, another realization begins forming. Constant emotional defense has stolen years they can never recover. The walls that once protected them have slowly become the prison itself. Suddenly they begin seeing the connection differently. Instead of asking, "What if I get hurt?" they begin asking a far more important question. What if I lose the person who has quietly remained inside my heart all this time? That question changes everything, because it shifts attention from fear toward value. Fear only calculates risk. Love calculates loss. When someone finally recognizes what they stand to lose, hesitation starts becoming unbearable. Every delayed conversation feels heavier. Every unsent message becomes another emotional weight. Every ordinary day without you quietly reminds them that waiting forever is no longer an option. The emotional equation has reversed. Once, returning felt dangerous. Now, staying away feels impossible. Still, this does not happen overnight. Inner transformation almost never announces itself dramatically. It unfolds through hundreds of tiny emotional moments that nobody else witnesses. They may find themselves smiling unexpectedly after remembering something you once said. They may stop resisting old memories because those memories no longer hurt in the same way. They may begin imagining introducing you to future versions of themselves, rather than only remembering past versions of who they were. Without realizing it, they stop treating the relationship as something finished and begin experiencing it as something unfinished. This difference matters more than most people understand. Finished stories belong to memory. Unfinished stories belong to possibility. The human mind naturally seeks closure when something meaningful remains emotionally incomplete. Jung believed that unresolved aspects of our lives continue asking for integration until we are willing to face them honestly. Love often behaves the same way. It continues knocking quietly until someone finally opens the emotional door they spent years pretending was permanently locked. You may have noticed another subtle change inside yourself as well. The desperation that once defined your waiting may no longer feel as overwhelming. You still care, perhaps more than ever, but your love has become quieter. It has matured. Instead of demanding certainty every day, it has learned how to exist without constant reassurance. This is not emotional resignation, it is emotional strength. And strangely enough, this transformation inside you often creates the safest possible emotional environment for someone else to return. When love no longer chases, it becomes easier to approach. There is an important reason for this. Emotional pressure activates emotional defense. Emotional safety invites honesty. Someone who has feared disappointing you, hurting you again, or failing to meet expectations often stays away because every imagined reunion feels emotionally impossible. But when they begin sensing that your heart has become calmer rather than harder, they no longer imagine judgment first. They imagine acceptance. That subtle expectation changes their courage more than you realize. Perhaps this is why you have recently felt less interested in forcing answers. Something inside you has quietly stopped fighting reality. You are no longer trying to control timing because you have begun understanding that emotional readiness cannot be rushed. Flowers bloom according to seasons, not demands. Human hearts follow similar rhythms. Every lesson that has not yet been learned eventually delays reunion, not because fate enjoys creating suffering, but because unfinished healing eventually repeats unfinished pain. Imagine someone carrying a suitcase filled with stones collected over many years. Every disappointment became another stone, every fear another stone, every regret another stone. Eventually, the suitcase becomes so heavy that even taking one step toward happiness feels impossible. Most people assume love requires someone to carry the suitcase together, yet sometimes love quietly waits while the person finally realizes they no longer need those stones at all. They begin placing them down one by one. Forgiveness, self-respect, acceptance, hope. None of these remove the past, but together they lighten the future enough for movement to become possible again. The phrase "coming home" means something much deeper than arriving at a physical place. Home is the emotional experience of finally stopping the endless battle inside yourself. Home is where pretending ends. Home is where defenses become unnecessary. Home is where you no longer perform strength because you finally feel safe enough to be honest. Before someone can come home to you, they must discover that place inside themselves first. Otherwise, every reunion becomes another temporary escape rather than a lasting beginning. This is why many long-distance relationships fail emotionally, even after physical distance disappears. Bodies return, while hearts remain guarded. Geography changes, while emotional habits stay exactly the same. But when someone truly becomes happy before they return, something extraordinary happens. Their presence no longer asks you to repair them. Their love no longer depends on constant reassurance. Their attention no longer swings between hope and avoidance. They arrive differently because they have become different. And perhaps this is the hidden truth your heart has been sensing without fully understanding. The person on your mind is not simply preparing to cross a physical distance. They are crossing an emotional landscape that has challenged them for far longer than you ever knew. Every fear they finally release becomes another step toward you. Every quiet moment of self-acceptance shortens the emotional road between your lives. Every day they choose hope over avoidance, makes home feel less like an impossible dream and more like an inevitable destination. Yet the most surprising part has nothing to do with the miles between you. It has everything to do with the one realization that finally convinces them they cannot spend another season pretending that what they feel can simply disappear if they stay busy long enough. That illusion has finally exhausted itself. For a long time, they believed that time alone would solve what courage refused to face. They expected memories to fade, emotions to become manageable, and the connection to settle quietly into the past. Instead, something unexpected happened. Life continued moving forward, but the part of themselves that had awakened because of you refused to move backward. They discovered that love does not always become weaker through absence. Sometimes, absence removes distractions until only the truth remains. Once that truth becomes impossible to ignore, returning no longer feels like giving in. It feels like finally becoming honest with themselves after spending far too long living behind emotional defenses that no longer protected anything worth protecting. One of the most beautiful yet misunderstood moments in emotional healing is when someone stops asking whether love is safe and starts asking whether living without it is truly living at all. This question changes the heart in ways that are difficult to explain because it does not create excitement first. It creates clarity. Suddenly, the endless calculations, the endless what-ifs, the endless rehearsals of failure begin losing their authority. The future is no longer judged by every possible disappointment, but by every possibility that might finally become real. They begin recognizing that every meaningful relationship carries uncertainty. There is no version of love that guarantees perfect outcomes. The only certainty is that avoiding what matters most eventually creates a regret that becomes heavier than any fear they once tried to escape. You may have wondered whether they ever thought about the small things, not the dramatic moments, but the ordinary ones that quietly become unforgettable. The way you listened without rushing them, the comfort of conversations that required no performance, the feeling that they could briefly stop pretending to be stronger, wiser, or less vulnerable than they truly were. These memories have a remarkable way of returning when someone finally begins healing. At first, painful memories dominate because unresolved emotions search for explanations. Later, as peace grows, gentler memories return. They are no longer reminders of loss. They become reminders of where the heart once felt understood. That emotional shift often signals that someone is no longer imprisoned by the past. They are beginning to imagine a future instead. Perhaps this is why your own heart has become strangely quieter. You may still miss them, but the panic has softened into something steadier. You no longer feel the need to force signs or invent certainty where none exists. Instead, there is a quiet confidence that surprises even you. It is not based on promises. It is not based on wishful thinking. It is based on the subtle realization that genuine emotional bonds cannot be manufactured, nor can they be erased simply because circumstances became complicated. They evolve. They challenge both people. They ask uncomfortable questions. And if both hearts continue growing rather than hiding, they often find each other again with a depth that did not exist before the separation. Carl Jung often explored the idea that the parts of ourselves we reject eventually return until we are willing to meet them with honesty. Relationships can become mirrors for this process. Sometimes the person you love awakens qualities you have forgotten in yourself. At the same time, you awaken parts of them that they have spent years avoiding. That is why emotionally significant relationships rarely remain comfortable from beginning to end. They invite transformation, and transformation almost always begins with discomfort. Yet once someone accepts what they have been resisting, the relationship itself begins feeling less like a threat and more like a place where growth is welcomed rather than feared. The person on your mind may have spent a long time believing that becoming emotionally independent meant needing no one. Many people confuse emotional walls with emotional strength because walls prevent immediate pain. What they do not prevent is loneliness. Eventually, even the strongest defenses become tiring when there is nobody left close enough to truly know who you are underneath them. Happiness does something remarkable to these defenses. It reminds people that peace is not created by isolation, but by connection that feels emotionally safe. As they discover this, the idea of coming back no longer feels like losing freedom. It begins feeling like choosing the life they secretly wanted all along. Notice how different this is from someone returning only because they feel guilty, lonely, or afraid. Those motivations rarely create lasting change. They often disappear once immediate discomfort fades. But someone who returns because they have genuinely become happier inside themselves carries a different emotional energy. They are no longer looking for someone to rescue them from themselves. They are looking for someone with whom they can finally share the version of themselves they worked so hard to become. That difference changes everything. Conversations become more honest, presence becomes more consistent, affection becomes less fearful. The relationship stops feeling like an emotional emergency and starts feeling like a home built one quiet moment at a time. You may still find yourself wondering why this process had to take so long. Why couldn't they simply realize all of this sooner? Why did life require so much waiting, confusion, and emotional uncertainty? The answer is rarely satisfying because it is deeply human. People cannot be forced into emotional readiness. Insight borrowed from someone else never transforms as completely as insight discovered through personal experience. Every lesson they learned while away became part of who they are becoming now. Without those difficult seasons, they might have returned physically while remaining emotionally unavailable. Instead, the delays slowly reshaped them from the inside until they became capable of offering something more genuine than they could have offered before. There is another quiet truth that deserves your attention. While they were changing, you were changing too. You may not always recognize your own transformation because it happened gradually. You learned how to carry hope without allowing it to consume your identity. You learned that loving someone does not require abandoning yourself. You learned that waiting is not the same as stopping your life. Most importantly, you discovered that your worth never depended on another person's emotional timing. These lessons are not punishments for having loved. They are gifts that ensure when love finally arrives in a healthier form, you will recognize it without needing to cling to it out of fear. Think for a moment about the meaning of home. Home is rarely remembered because of its walls. It is remembered because of how we felt inside them. The same is true emotionally. A person becomes home when they create an experience where your nervous system can finally rest, where your heart no longer feels like it must constantly prove its value, where honesty replaces performance and acceptance replaces fear. If someone is truly coming home, they are not only returning to you, they are returning to the emotional place where they once felt most like themselves before fear convinced them to leave. This realization often arrives quietly. They may notice that no matter how many new places they visit, no matter how many people they meet, no matter how much life changes around them, the emotional comparison never fully disappears. They stop asking whether someone else is more exciting. Instead, they begin asking where they felt the greatest sense of peace. Excitement fades, novelty fades, even intense attraction eventually settles, but emotional peace has a remarkable way of becoming more valuable with every passing year. That is why mature love rarely chases constant intensity. It searches for truth, consistency, and the quiet joy of finally feeling understood. If they have become happier, it is likely because they have stopped carrying impossible expectations. They no longer expect perfection from themselves or from love. They understand now that every meaningful relationship requires humility, forgiveness, and the willingness to begin again. That realization removes one of the greatest barriers to reunion. Perfection creates pressure. Acceptance creates movement. Once someone accepts that they do not need to become flawless before reaching out, the first step suddenly becomes possible. Many reunions begin not with certainty, but with the simple courage to stop hiding behind imagined conditions that were never truly necessary. Perhaps this is also the message your own heart needs today. You do not need to become someone else to deserve lasting love. You do not need to erase every scar, explain every tear, or prove that you handled every painful season perfectly. Real emotional intimacy is built between imperfect people who choose honesty over performance. The greatest gift you can offer another heart is not perfection, it is authenticity. And authenticity quietly invites authenticity in return. As emotional distance comes to an end, something beautiful happens that few people anticipate. The separation itself begins revealing its purpose. It was never meant to convince either of you that love was impossible. It was meant to uncover everything that had been silently standing in the way of receiving it fully. Every misunderstanding exposed a fear that needed healing. Every delay uncovered an insecurity that needed compassion. Every lonely night gradually taught both hearts the difference between attachment driven by anxiety and love rooted in genuine emotional presence. Without realizing it, both of you were becoming capable of creating something steadier than what existed before. If you ever begin doubting again, remember this gentle truth. The deepest emotional changes rarely announce themselves with noise. They begin in the quiet moments, when someone chooses honesty over avoidance, hope over fear, connection over isolation. Long before footsteps approach the door, the journey home has already begun inside the heart. That invisible journey is often the most important part, because it determines whether the reunion becomes temporary or lasting. Physical closeness means very little if emotional walls remain untouched. But when those walls finally come down, even ordinary moments begin carrying extraordinary meaning. Maybe that is why this message found you today. Not to promise a fantasy or encourage you to ignore reality, but to remind you that genuine emotional healing changes people in ways that even they never expected. Someone who has finally found peace within themselves no longer runs from what they value most. They stop measuring love by fear and begin measuring it by truth. They understand that home is not simply a destination on a map. It is the place where the heart no longer feels divided against itself. So if your heart has quietly been whispering that something is changing, listen to that feeling with wisdom rather than desperation. Let hope remain gentle. Let patience remain kind to you. Continue becoming the peaceful person you were always meant to be. Because whether someone arrives tomorrow or later than you expect, your own healing is never wasted. It prepares you to receive love without fear, to recognize sincerity without confusion, and to build a relationship that rests on emotional honesty instead of uncertainty. And if these words reached a place inside you that has been waiting to feel understood, hold on to this one final thought. Sometimes the greatest sign that someone is coming home is not that they suddenly appear before you. It is that both hearts have finally become capable of recognizing home when they find it again. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this message spoke to something deeply personal within your heart, I hope it reminded you that meaningful love is not only about finding the right person, but also about becoming emotionally ready to receive and sustain that connection. If you enjoy reflections like these, subscribe to The Deep Mind, where we continue exploring the quiet psychological truths that help us understand love, healing, and the hidden journeys of the human heart. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself.